Good afternoon, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us for this self-service administration tips and tricks. And before I turn it over to Andrew and Keith, I wanted to talk a little bit about the ground rules. One, everyone should have joined. When you joined, you should have been on mute. If you could remain on mute throughout the presentation, just to cut down on background noise, we would highly appreciate that. For any questions you may have, please feel free to ask those real time. And you can do so by clicking on the chat icon, which is at the bottom of the Zoom screen, which will bring up a chat window on the right-hand side. And from there, you can put any question into the chat. If Andrew and Keith are unable to answer their question at that moment while they're going through the presentation, we will certainly leave time and circle back towards the end of the presentation to get those questions answered for you. Okay, and lastly, obviously, if you're taking notes, that's great. We wanted to let you know that we will be sending out a link of the full webinar to include the slides as well as the audio. So you will be able to reference that as well. So just wanted you to know that as you're taking notes that you will be able to look back on the webinar recording as well. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Andrew and Keith.
Be helpful if we started off not on mute. Good afternoon, everybody. Just quick introduction. You've got Keith Gaucher. He's going to be presenting. He's one of our senior system administrators in the core team, and then myself, Andrew Russell. I'm a director of the core team. We actually manage about 60 clients for colleague services, and we've done a lot of self-service implementations. So we wanted to share our knowledge with the community and make sure that schools know what to expect as they're rolling out different services in self-service. So to start with, if you're going to be implementing student planning or any module inside of self-service, highly recommend proper planning communication, building a partnership with your registrar or your bursar or your financial aid office, and talking about their expectations and the IT office's budgets and limitations is a very good thing. Student planning specifically creates a new workload for your servers. It's important to know how many students, faculty, and staff are going to be connecting at one time. Around 250 registrations an hour is average. I will say that that's a very doable number. If you do anything over that, you start to creep into a realm of some pretty large expenses on the IT budget. If you can build those counts, you can use the Ellucian hardware spreadsheet to calculate those hardware needs. That's available out in the hub. Highly recommend the use of registration priorities. It helps keep load down. It also helps stabilize registration numbers per day. It really helps kind of push those students to register because they know that they've got to get in and do it then, or they got to sit and wait. So all those should, at the very, we start with this slide because it's the most important. The communication between the different departments and knowing what everybody expects will help you have a successful implementation. Now, to get into the more nitty-gritty, here's Keith Gaucher.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have just probably some things that can be found in the documentation with Ellucian, but this is a great quick reference, and maybe toward the end we can entertain some questions regarding this. But your setup and your settings, for those of you who may not already know, these are done in web configuration pages on the appropriate servers, either the web API or the self-service server. Some things you want to make sure you do is, as indicated in this slide, the maximum worker settings on the web API server should be set to 1, and that idle timeout, which, and by the way, max workers does come across as 1 even after an upgrade, after an installation, but the idle timeout will get reset back to its default, which is only 20 instead of 1440. And that becomes pretty significant because it will actually drop your connections a lot sooner. And likewise, so both servers want to be set as indicated, 2 for the self-service max workers, and but both of the idle timeout should be 1440. We find a lot of discussion about this, but in the documentation, it does tell you that as long as, and we'll get to it in a moment, warm-up scripts are set up to fully recycle the application pools, no recycle settings should be set within IIS. And that's important to know because you could easily have them recycling kind of in a sense over each other. And like I said, we get to the warm-up scripts, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but the primary thing is you surely don't want this thing recycling after you've already run your warm-up scripts, because then your warm-up scripts are no longer cached. So I would mention that as maybe a means of making sure everybody understands the significance of leaving it off. DAS reader. I've seen clients implement self-service without doing it because they just didn't expect a lot of volume in the beginning, but it's something you want to set up and make sure that to basically take the pressure off of, or the volume off of your default DAS listener, and set the DAS connection pool size to the same thing that you have in DMI defaults in SA Valet. So I believe Andrew will talk a little bit more about that as far as resources later, but just make sure that that setting is set, and that'll help offset some of it. We found it's quite useful when the need of any type of DMI resets that need to happen, it doesn't interrupt the entire colleague community if there's a need for that. Same thing with the connection pool size. Though it says web API connection limit, it's actually on the self-service admin page. So just keep that in mind if you've not done this before. You want to set that to 400, and that is exactly what the documentation indicates. Now, just a little bit more about the warm-up scripts. We tend to get questions about this, but if you do the complete warm-up script setup that also actually involves a recycle of the API, though that whole reset setting of the or recycle settings within IIS is unnecessary. And though this is on the web API server, we want to make sure that you set this up, and remember that you want to set it up at a time where it's got time to actually run in the morning before the start of the business day. That, of course, caches a lot of the probably common data sources into the application, so that the first user that goes in the morning is not the one that starts the caching. One interesting thing about the first user that goes in, if the warm-up script has not been run, the first user that goes in will only cache the scripts associated with their access. So that's just one of the things to consider. So you really want the warm-up scripts running. It will take a lot of that first sign in and make it a lot faster. There's a link, of course, there that'll get you some more detail on the hub. There are new scripts delivered with every new installation. So, and easily could be, if you're not doing an InPlace upgrade, it would be in a different folder, even if you're pointing to the existing bin directory. So we suggest that you make sure that that's verified every time you do an upgrade, especially if you're because there's some institutions that like to put those things in different places based on the way they do business and how they have their security set up. So you want to make sure that with every self-service web API upgrade, in this particular case, the web API, because sometimes we do get some new releases, some bug fixes and things like that. You want to make sure and go check that that has not changed, or the location of that warm-up script file hasn't changed. Lastly, on this screen, we want to make sure that you set up the user that is being passed with the warm-up script initialization needs to be set up on CCDF that it does not expire. You want to make sure that well, or at least the expiration date is far out into the future, because you don't want, it will fail. I may have failed to mention this morning that you also want to test this script. There's a lot of articles out there that can tell you about some false positives, some things you'll see in the testing that really are not errors. They're kind of like colleague, they're just kind of informational, but you want to test it to make sure it's running when you implement it, and that way you can be sure that you are getting all this stuff cached. And I think I'm volleying back to Andrew at this point.
Yeah. So if you come through the planning phase and you need more than 250 users to register at a given time, or you're going to, like with financial aid module, if you're going to have 1,000 people hit at a given time, then you really are a good candidate for load balancing. Load balancing can be very tricky. So there's some must-dos if you're going to do load balancing. The first thing is machine key matching. So what that means is there's a machine key that gets set on the API side or on the self-service side. And when you set up load balancing with the way they've configured it, you have to have those machine keys match. So the machine key needs to match on all the API servers, and then it needs to match on all the self-service servers specifically. We've run into a lot of problems with round robin load balancing under heavy load. That's where you set up the load balancing through the DNS servers. What we found under heavy load is that one server in particular will get hit pretty hard, and then all the others will sit idle. And so basically you end up with a bottleneck of the one particular server, which you don't want. So you definitely want to use either a appliance to load balance, like Barracuda makes one, F5 makes one, or the IIS load balancer. We've had some clients have a lot of luck with that lately. And in those, with those setups, you want to do a least connections or least activity balancing strategy. And you want to make sure that you don't use session affinity. Web API is stateless, and any node being balanced can handle the request as long as the IIS software is correct. Load testing. So we've been doing a lot of load testing this year, and specifically with JMeter. And what I can tell you is it seems very overwhelming at first. There's a lot of different fields, a lot of different parameters to input, but if you just sit down and follow the guide, it's actually very doable. General recommendation is to start with one user, one server, get that test to run properly, and then start to ramp up. You can go from 1 to 50 to 100, and then depending on how many users you want to have it hit at a given time, we recommend going double. So if you're going to do 250 users per hour, we would load test for 500, maybe even 750. The goal here is to generate a synthetic load on the servers so that you can find where your bottlenecks are. Illusion is releasing new tests every quarter with the releases on self-service. They release new tests for 227 and 228. A little quick tip is that you can run the later versions of JMeter. They are backward compatible, but if you have problems with them and you need support, you'll need to roll back to 213. Just had a lot better luck with the interface on the later versions of JMeter. The new tests released with every new version are in the app data folder on the self-service side. So they do deliver these with every upgrade, and you just got to go out and grab them. Some additional information about load testing. This is based off questions we got this morning. First off, JMeter got a really bad name with WebVisor. It just did not generate the load that schools needed to really test out their infrastructure. And so when JMeter is mentioned nowadays, everybody kind of winces. And that's rightly so for WebVisor, but I can tell you for a fact that JMeter testing with self-service works great. For whatever reason, they've figured this out, and you're able to generate a good load. And a good load test to me is when we crash the server. We've crashed several servers from doing load tests, and we do these after hours for a reason. So, that's a good sign. Now, if you're still weary about JMeter, or you want to do a load higher than what you feel like JMeter can provide, I would say the max cap that I could do through JMeter as far as connection testing would be about 2,000. Then there is loadimpact.com, which is a great load testing website. It is expensive, but the way that loadimpact.com works is you can set up a proxy, and basically it will watch your session and then re-implement that session over many virtual machines. So you could generate 1,000 connections over 250 VMs and get less of a synthetic load and more of a real world scenario. So there are other options other than JMeter, but right now we're seeing that JMeter is sufficient for load testing. Overall performance issues, and this is where we get brought in for the most part. So, so for student planning, additional load, we run into some situations where schools had older hardware and they just were not able to handle their additional load on the colleague server or in their VM host environment. Generally, there's some additional hardware that's needed for student planning. So that goes back to the planning where you talk to either registrar talk to the admins or the admins talk to the registrar and really get a good feel for, okay, what are we expecting? And then looking at the hardware guide and following that. And that's specifically for student planning. We have not needed to do that for financial aid or for the finance module or the budget module. Regarding the colleague server load, generally it's the SAN or the disks that are underneath the SAN. If you've got an older SAN or older set of operating system disks that are running colleague, generally the best way to handle that is to replace those. It's not a cheap investment, we realize, but there's not a whole lot you can do when your drives are slow. If the other thing is if you're running something like HPUX or an older Solaris box or older AIX box, you might actually run out of memory. We've had a couple of schools that just flat out ran out of memory after going to student planning. But that's with extremely old hardware. And so be on the watch for that. We run into a situation with listener connection limits. The application listeners and the DASs have an SA Valet, there's a connection limit. And the old school philosophy was that you set those and restricted those down to the number of licenses you have. That has changed over the last, say, 5 years. And now the thought is you need to get those connection limits as high as you can make them. So right now, the general recommendation is to get them above 1,000. And the reason for that is self-service generates a lot of small connections back to the listeners. And for the time that it takes to release those connections, it creates another one. And so you start to see connections pile up on the listeners and easily overwhelm. Say you've got it set to 300, which is the default. You can easily overwhelm it. Memory allocations, we've run into schools that don't have JVM arguments set on their listeners. And so, the general minimum recommendation there is 2 gigabytes for the heap size, the max heap size. So for the running out of unit out of licenses, specifically what happens there is schools will run WebAdvisor and self-service in tandem. And the web pool for WebAdvisor and the web pool for self-service are separate things. So if you run those at the same time, you're effectively doubling the amount of connectivity that you're needing for web applications. So say you've got 20 licenses for WebAdvisor and 20 licenses for self-service. Well, there's 40 licenses. And if you're already at your cap or near your cap of licenses, you're just going to flat run out. And so the way you deal with that the most easily is to buy additional unit out licenses. If you've been putting that off for a while, you really can't put it off when you go to student planning. The other way to deal with that is more aggressively go to self-service and drop that unit WebAdvisor number down, which is difficult to do. I've not seen a school do that successfully yet. And then finally, data issues. So specifically with unit data, with the way that self-service is built, it does not handle bad data in certain areas. In fact, it will cause application crashes in certain areas. The anecdote I can give for that is we worked with a client who called us and said, we can't pull up sporadic students on WebAdvisor and student planning. And originally we thought it was about half their student body. Then we started whittling it down and realized it was about 1,000 students. And it took us a while to realize that what had happened was they had a custom batch process that allowed an end user to update 1,000 records with a special character and an address field. And so that caused those people to be unavailable in student planning. So if you are specifically on Unidata, it's considered best practice to run your data scanners before you go live with student planning and try and clean that stuff up as best as possible. Logging. Now the situation I just gave you where they had that data issue, Illusion has to have seen the issue that you're having for them to code for it in their logs, as far as I've seen. So we couldn't, in the situation we had, we couldn't see anything in the API logs or the app listener logs. That's why it's so important to run the data scanners. We actually had to create a custom version of the API and then step through the code to find the problem. But if you are having connectivity issues or intermittent issues, the API and the app listener logs are the first place to look. This is little quick tip as far as doing upgrades and doing day-to-day administration with the sitemap. So if under the admin page in self-service, go into site permissions, you can change what roles are assigned to different sites. All that information goes into one file called sitemap.config. So you can build all that out and test, and then and as long as you're happy with it, you can copy that to a similar version of self-service in production. So if you're doing an upgrade or you're making a lot of sitemap changes, then you can just copy that one file over. We have seen schools have up to 200 changes to the sitemap config. So this particular little tip helped them out. It saved them hours of going back into the site permissions page and updating that. The last thing I would say about site permissions for self-service, where you assign roles to screens and menus, is try and keep it as standard as possible. They have a list of about 9 different roles that they use in their configurations. If you can stick to that as close as possible, it will help you when you upgrade. And you're going to do a lot of upgrades with self-service. Right now, Ellucian's requiring clients to be within 3 versions of the newest version to be certified. Right now, the last version that was certified was 226. And so, I mean, that's just 9 months of certification per product. So you've really got to try and stay as standard to the product that was delivered as possible. If not, then you got to use things like this. Speaking of upgrades, InPlace Upgrades are currently working, which is a blessing. For the longest time, InPlace Upgrades would not work, and it was mainly because they were making a lot of changes with the user experience in CSS. And so what we would do is we'd run the upgrade and we'd test and see that the school CSS needed to be rebuilt. So we started doing side-by-side upgrades, which generally became a lot of work for everybody involved because we were rebuilding the application every time. Thankfully, they've stopped messing with the user experience, and now the InPlace upgrades work every time. However, because of the prior plans that we've had, problems that we've had in the past, we highly recommend making a backup of the sites that you're upgrading. Just making a copy and paste backup in self-service and API before you do the upgrades, and by all means, do them in test first to see how it works. This is our final slide, the Google Analytics. With WebVisor, you actually had to write a little bit of custom code to be able to use Google Analytics. A lot of schools didn't do it for that reason. With self-service, you just quite literally just throw your tagging ID into a field under the self-service admin site analytics page and hit save, and the next day you should start getting analytics. So this is fantastic to see how many people are using self-service, how many people are using specific modules, what times of days, that type thing. If you've never studied your end user activity this way, it is an invaluable tool to know when is it going to be safe for us to work on the system, when is it safe for us to take the system down, and where are students spending all their time? Are they having performance issues? Because you can get response times on those sorts of things. So yeah, highly recommended. And we're to the questions. So we're going to be here for the next 15-20 minutes, or as long as we need to, really. So if you have any questions, please send us those in chat, or at this point you can come off mute and ask any questions you need. Did we answer all the questions this time?
Quiet group, no questions yet. As Andrew said, if you have a question, okay. Yes, there will be a recording. We certainly will be sending that out early next week, so you'll be able to reference back to that.
Hello, this is
Yes,
Tarek.
hey. Uh-huh.
I don't do a lot of the back-end administration, but I do know that I believe what we've been doing is reinstalling every time there's an upgrade. Is that what you meant by in place versus the other way you mentioned?
Yeah, so the in-place upgrades, meaning that there's 2 options when you run the installer. You can either do upgrade or install a new website. And the upgrade option, you can just upgrade your existing site and it'll work fine nowadays. Back, it was about a year and a half ago, it wasn't working. So we had to do side-by-side installs, which is generating a new site, putting all the customizations back in, and then doing a
Yes.
port swap.
Oh gosh, yeah, we have an extensive list of documentation of customizations that have to be put back.
Yeah.
So I think that that's what you're referring to. That would be amazing to not have to do that.
Yeah, I would highly recommend doing it. Doing a test to see how it worked out for you. The schools we've seen a lot of customizations. There's a chance something might break, but we've had a very good string over the last 4 versions or so, where the InPlace upgrades have been working fine.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. What other questions are out there? Anything else? Okay. If not, we will be here if you want to have a one-on-one or more private conversation. We will be on the line for a bit, and you can hang out there. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We will be continuing our webinar series. You can always find what's up next with Forelli at forelli.com / what's next, or what's new, excuse me. And if you have any ideas of possible webinar topics, please feel free to email those as well to info@forelli.com. All right, thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.